that could get us in trouble. But there's actually like a couple of them that are still like around as far as micronations go. Like Sealand, I was just saying, is like one of the most established, and like probably the one of the longest living. I don't know if it's the longest. Probably not the longest lived, but it has like actual relations with the United Kingdom. Like, even though it's not officially recognized as a country, it does have international sales agreements with Coca-Cola. They have a passport that's recognized in Scotland, which is like their closest like recognized country, and they have like an actual economy that's based on running super secure servers, where they have they have like a don't ask don't tell policy on what's on those servers, and
do they have land?
Technically, I think there is land underneath of the rig, but it's basically an oil rig. Yeah, it's an oil rig that has been around for a while. I don't know how far. I don't know if like you can always see the land or what, but like it's just like an oil rig that exists like
they have servers
off the coast of the UK. My understanding, yes, is that their main like thing is that they run servers from this place.
Okay, so there's this article that was on 1729.com about how to start a new country, and then I found it through a YouTube video that broke it down. And so they talk about like how to start a new country. So there's seven different ways to start a new country. First is election, so gaining power and winning an election. The second is revolution, which requires bloodshed. The third is war, which also requires bloodshed. And then the fourth is micronations, which is a nation within a nation. The fifth is seasteading, which is what you're talking about. The sixth is space. And the seventh is so-called cloud countries.
Cloud countries, like people who are like doing microservers, like Discord micronations.
So a cloud country. So the cloud country is like kind of the reason for the article, and the reason it was in my browser, which is basically a cloud country is country first, land last, or community first, land last. And so a cloud country, you basically get people to agree that they are a part of the same entity first, and you establish the country first, and then you go after land. And then the concept is kind of going after, what's the word for it? Discontiguous land. So basically, like, someone will buy a piece of property in Scotland, and someone else will buy a piece of property in Los Angeles, and then you will deem those properties essentially micronations in a sense. But basically, it's just property that's owned by the community. And so being able to develop a community of people that's million strong, which is more than many countries, and then purchase land, and then over time be, the ultimate kind of societal recognition is recognition by the United Nations.
So which like almost nobody gets.
Right, but like then the question becomes, why do you need that? Right, like do you really need to?
Yeah.
I mean, if you can in theory get, Facebook has billions of users, like Twitter has like billions. Like if you can get 10 million people to consent to being a part of an organization that acts like a country, is it enough of a country to still be a country?
Yeah. I mean, I think it's one of those things that kind of leads to, it's kind of in two different directions. On the one hand, it exposes how much international institutions that wield insane amounts of power are total bullshit and all in our mind, right? Like, what is the United Nations? It's a bunch of like rich kids that get together, or rich old folks rather, who get together and make decisions in representation of other things. They have no like actual teeth, right? That's the whole thing about the UN that people are critiquing now, is like, why are we even part of the United Nations? Why are we even part of these organizations? Like, they don't have power, and a lot of people kind of take advantage of those organizations anyways. But so long as you believe it has power, it does have power. But at the same time, a nation is itself like what's the Benedict Anderson's this like really cool anthropologist that wrote a book called Imagined Communities. And I think everyone needs to kind of go back and reread the book because it's more relevant now than it probably ever was. And the whole idea that like a nation is not real. It's an imagined community, and it only exists because like our minds create identities and we align ourselves with these communities and they become part of who we are. And that is a really powerful idea. And so I don't know, I really like it as an idea to like kind of understand it. But from that idea of like, let's all just buy some land and we'll just claim it for our cumulative micronation, it kind of shows that like from that perspective it kind of could work. But then it leads to this idea of like, how do you govern a nation that way? Because like to be recognized you have to have a governance structure, and maybe that's where like, yeah, right, what are the terms of citizenship? And it kind of becomes like, you know, it kind of lends one to think like, well, what about like these like DAO, these like decentralized autonomous organizations? That's like a big thing that like I saw a really interesting, one of the founders of one of the DAO tokens gave a talk here in Bratislava. He's from here, and gave this really interesting talk about how like you can have this entirely run, like you could have a nation run by smart contract, and just like everyone has a consensual agreement, and there's, so long as it's set up really well, I think it could actually be a really interesting idea. Like a lot of it makes me kind of wonder, like, why don't we do that in countries already, right? Like,
hey, breakfast set in
modern constitutional,
if you have a question for the geniuses,
constitutional systems, right? Constitutional republics, constitutional democracies have a framework of limitations, right? They have something that we have agreed to, or not agreed to, but that we force as the levers of how the system works. Why not digitize those through smart contracts? And basically you cannot have any more corruption than the system can allow. You can't have people skirting the system in corruption, right? You can still have corruption in it's like, well, you shouldn't do that, but you can. Right. There will still be that, right? There's always the gray zone in the definition, like, which is why we have a juridical system to begin with.
So before we go deep on DAOs and crypto, I want to track back to what you said about Benedict and that kind of concept of imagined communities. So there's this frame that I really like. It's actually kind of like the culmination of the book, The Ascent of Humanity by Charles Eisenstein. And he talks about this concept of the storyteller consciousness. So the storyteller consciousness is the conscious awareness that the stories we tell create the reality that we see. As we use the storyteller consciousness, we begin to disbelieve our labels, categories, and other abstractions as we come into contact with this human reality. Science, technology, politics, and government are all themselves stories. America is a story. France is a story. The law is a story. Words and symbols, that is all. They each have no more meaning than that which we agree upon. Our mistake has not been in telling stories, only in thinking that they are real. When we let go of that, we are able to play with them consciously and let go of them when they no longer serve us. So yeah, basically that's kind of like, as I'm learning about this notion of, you know, cloud countries, you know, poly-states is kind of the sci-fi, or there's a lot of different ways that people are describing the same thing, which is essentially a group of people coming together to form a series of agreements, and then, you know, kind of like one in cooperative is intending, like figuring the rest out, right? Like the typical way to start a country is you plant and defend a flag, or you know, take your flag into somebody else's country and then you clear them out.
And it's very Ford style. Do you have a flag?
Actually, yeah, we should have a flag. Ooh.
Gotta have a flag.
Gotta have a flag. Yeah, so, you know, I think that this article was published on a, I guess like a not crypto, but like blockchain kind of blog. And it was talking about how to use blockchain to reverse the process and go for land last, and like what the minimum necessary innovation would be. So yeah, it's an interesting concept that I think is becoming very possible.
I think it's interesting, right? From the perspective of a nation, a land is not needed. From the perspective of a state or an economy, the land is needed.
Mm-hmm.
But a nation is really just a group of people that share a common identity. You don't need land to do that. You need land to like live on, and you need land to like procure resources. So like in the grand scheme of an ecology of nations, there needs to be some kind of land. But from the grand scheme of like, do you need land in order to have a nation? I don't think that you really do. Like Anonymous could become its own nation.
Yeah,
If they could decide what it is they believe, right? Like, I mean, that's kind of the thing, right? Since Occupy Wall Street, they haven't been sure what they believe in. And half of them kind of are like, we're more libertarian, and the other half are like, I don't know, we're more just social justice, like, call it as we see it. Like, they don't seem to have like a set of beliefs that could be a nation, I guess.
Mm-hmm.
It could be two different nations.
Well, they didn't start with a series of beliefs. They started with, this is what we don't believe. This is
Exactly. Yeah, and that is really powerful in short bursts.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
That is a sprint identity, because the moment you address it, or the moment something else takes your attention, it no longer becomes part of your it no longer becomes powerful or potent as a social identity. It can still be part of your personal identity, but social identities are evoked based on context. And as Occupy Wall Street kind of washed away, and a lot of the other momentum kind of faded away, so did the relevance of Anonymous. But a lot of this also had to do with like the infighting of the group that was pretty widely reported around the 2016 election. People weren't really sure, did they support the burn the system down chaos demon of the Trumpism, or did they try and support Hillary Clinton despite the fact that a lot of people, I think, were like, guys, weren't we fighting against Hillary Clinton and her types? And so there wasn't a very clear decision for them to support it. My understanding is that a lot of infighting led to a lot of the lack of engagement on their part post 2016. But I've also heard and seen some stuff that the rumbles are starting again.
And that's what happens when you have fracturing of agreements in a leaderless community, right? So you have like this headless community, and then you have the headless community splits. I mean, Burning Man's actually a really great example too.
Burning Man.
With Burning Man, the leadership, it hasn't really been a strong leadership because it's more community focused by design. And then when COVID happened and everybody's like vax or no vax, there was a fracturing. And because there was no strong leadership in the community, no one could step in and say, hey, let's all get along, or hey, let's all respect everybody's values. So there was no one that could step up and bring everybody back together when the fracture started. So the fracture just stayed.
I'll meet you at Burning Man.
Yeah, and that's kind of the interesting thing about like complex adaptive systems, like whether it's a human organization or even just like a herd of like buffalo, right? If a predator cuts through the middle and there's a schism that's created in the group, sometimes the group naturally comes back together because there's other environmental forces that keep it together. But other times it just splits into two groups and they go about their merry way. And what's left is the memory that it used to be one unit. And I think in the case of certain organizations like Anonymous,
I'm usually not up this early, Dave.
There's the memory that it was a unit, and it's that sort of like mnemonic nostalgia that makes us think like, oh, they used to be this, they used to be this. Like, they still are a thing. Like, there are people doing stuff under that banner still. It's just maybe multiple groups that are doing it, but there's no more or less, I don't know, leadership, I guess. I mean, there's rumor that there was like a very close cabal of guys that were leading a lot of the high profile stuff, and a lot of those guys were taken out or left and all of that stuff, but we're not really sure like what's up beyond that. So when it comes to Burning Man, I mean, you kind of see the same thing, but you see that I think in a lot of complex adaptive systems, right? Like,
yeah, Dave's on YouTube.
The group is kind of like emergent, right? It's generated from those lower level things that happen.
Let me give you the link for Twitch.
And so, insofar as the group exists, there's really more questions of like, how groupish is it, right? Is it like is it just like a group of individuals that share a trait, and so we're drawing a circle around them and calling them a group, or Is it like a cell
Thanks,
structure, right? Are there localized organizations but no centralized organization? Like, for example, like Antifa, there's localized
Antifa.
community cells of Antifa that are sufficiently well organized to be called groups, right? They have like initiation procedures. Some of them have mailing lists. Some of them have their own, like,
Mailing
some of them
lists,
have
that's
their
all you
own
need?
subreddits
So pausing
and
you for a
Facebook
second.
groups.
Pausing you for a second there. So you said, are they a group, and then you started to rattle off a bunch of initiation rituals and stuff like that. Like, so it kind of calls into question, how do you define a group? How do you define a country? Because in this article that we're talking about, they say like, well, the societal definition is recognition by the United Nations, but functionally that's not needed. Functionally a bunch of people can come together and say we belong, and that's it.
Yeah.
And
So this is like a fun one. Is the Cherokee Nation recognized by the United
Dave,
Nations?
You're here.
I don't believe so.
So it is. So this is the thing. Like the difference between country and nation becomes very clear very quickly
Even
when you
terrorists wish
see.
others
Are
happy
any
birthday.
Native American nations recognized at the UN?
Not to my knowledge.
So I don't. Not to my knowledge either. Yet they are like functional. They have all of the criteria needed to be a country. They have their own land. They have their own leadership structure. They have their own governance structures. Many of them have their own constitutions. I mean, they effectively exist as tolerated micronations within the U.S. borders.
A group again.
They have their own representation to the to Washington D.C., despite the fact that D.C. doesn't seem to give a crap about them. But
It'd be interesting to, and part of my reasoning for wanting to have this conversation is that we're exploring ways that we can explain this through essentially a pitch deck, and what this is making me think of is creating kind of like a something between a gamified, like a gamification, right? Like, say, like a leaderboard in a sense, but combined with like feature requests. And so, like, with a platform feature, like, oh, I really want this feature, and then everybody votes up, and when it gets voted to the top, then hopefully the people who manage the software enact the change. But if you combine that with something like a gamification board, and you say like, we want to be recognized by the United Nations, and everybody's like, that's not really important, like, and so everybody like at the beginning votes it up and says like, this is our end goal, this is what we're doing long term. And then like a year later, everybody's like, well, like, I don't know, like we're all, getting an income from this. We're all getting our universal basic income or whatever equivalent.
Thank you, Snake Eye.
Like I'm getting
Good
my,
morning, Snake Eye.
relational needs met. Like I feel a
Thank
part
you
of
for
something.
resubscribing.
I don't need to be
appreciate your
recognized by the United Nations.
support.
Cool, I'm gonna take my vote off.
Woohoo.
Would be a really interesting way of kind of bringing people together and highlighting that every aspect of that, all of those accomplishments are a choice. And constantly getting to say like, I am choosing to be here for these well, actually, okay, that the reason that I was here for, I don't really need that too much. And you get to change your mind. I think that concept of being able to change your mind is not prevalent in anything with a nation state. But I think the thing that's most important to me personally is proliferating this conscious awareness of storytelling, and this conscious awareness of like, hey, like we are doing this thing because we choose to tell the story, and as soon as we stop telling the story, we are no longer doing it. And also, we can change the story however we so choose along the way, so long as we get everybody together and say, do we all consent to a change of story?
Yeah, and I think that's kind of a funny thing to think about when you compare it to like other, like what we have today.
Alan, good morning.
People don't
Welcome
think
in.
about the malleability of the idea of a nation and what it stands for until it's in
The group
crisis.
is on Facebook.
And like in the US today, there are people saying this is what the nation stands for, this is how we define it. And there are some people saying we want to preserve it based on these points, and other people saying we want to change it based on these other points. And that seems to be like an interesting framework for kind of framing cultural conflict, right? Is like it's a disagreement on what the core values are, the definitional beliefs of the system that kind of emerge from groups of individuals. And so, I mean, there's a way of leveraging. I mean, I proposed at length this thing called the identity information system. and it's basically a suite of information processing mechanisms in our mind
we
that
went
we've
back to YouTube to go
experimentally
off of.
studied that discuss
There's a
how
lot
it is
there.
that the idea of a imagined community, like a nation or a religion or a culture, arise and how they're sustained.
Good, Jim.
What's interesting though is that there's constraints on how it works, because you need to have a certain amount of information to keep the system stable, right? You need to have a certain amount of information repeated in humans, right? If this is a system run with humans, we need to have a certain amount of repetition in the system so that we keep remembering what it is that we stand for. And
So what you're saying is that we need a pledge.
yeah, I mean, I don't think that there's any surprise that the co-occurrence of the rise of social media, which is just egotism at the speed of light, and
Egotism at the speed of light.
the dropping nationally of the Pledge of Allegiance in schools
Ikimusan.
coincide with a lag when
Ikimusan.
those students are graduating, a sort of identity crisis at the national level.
I mean, it'd be
The Pledge of
interesting to
Allegiance
have-
was not perfect, but it did
Yeah.
reaffirm a set of national values every morning that is useful. I mean, you need to have that.
It'd be interesting to have. So I mean, it'd be interesting to have essentially like a change log. Let's look at the Pledge of Allegiance, for example. So you have a change log of the Pledge of Allegiance, and let's, for the sake of example, look at the part in the Pledge of Allegiance of one nation under God.
Yes.
So-
Good. I was hoping you would say that, because otherwise I was going to ask that we did that one instead. Yeah.
So one nation under God. If let's say someone proposes a change, and say we would like to change this to one nation under one.
So here's an interesting historical perspective, though, right? Is that was not originally in the pledge. We added that into the pledge during the Cold War to differentiate ourselves from communists.
Box
Communists
Bozo,
don't believe in
Box
God?
Bozo.
Well, the communist states, Marxism said that religion is the opiate of the people, right? That was a quote from Marx, and so a lot of Marxist states became atheist officially. So China, for example, is atheist by decree. Czechoslovakia also was atheist by decree. They went through great lengths to like suppress and even torture religious leaders in Czechoslovakia. So
Interesting.
you do see this,
One
like the
nation
USSR
under
was
God.
avowedly
So one
atheist.
nation under God is entirely a product of the Cold War.
Yeah. Yeah. Like, to put it as simply as
Interesting.
possible, yeah, we did that deliberately to differentiate our identity as Americans
Interesting.
with one nation under God. No particular God, but I think you kind of know which one they were suggesting.
Yeah.
Against a godless communism, when it's kind of like, really, of all the differences that existed between American as an ideal and communism, that's the one you hung your hat on?
Yeah.
But I think that also coincides with a particular time
It's fascinating,
in
right?
U.S. political strategy
One
where
nation
they
under
were
Dow.
courting Southern voters and a shift in the Republican and Democrat Party, all of that nonsense. But changelog, that
Yeah,
was
so-
an addition, right? Let's
Okay,
add this
so-
line of code.
So now the Cold War is over, and the Cold War II might be starting, but different conversation. And so
War II,
the
oof.
Cold War is over, and we say like, hey, that is outdated. We would like to remove one nation under God. So I, a citizen of this country, submit to the changelog like, I would like to remove this, and then I basically campaign
One
for
nation
others
under
to
duress.
upvote or vote on my clause.
Yeah.
What would be interesting, right? So let's say you get enough
Alright, I'm
votes,
gonna
and then
start a
eventually it gets
campaign.
changed, and then
I'm gonna start a
something else
campaign
goes
and a
in. You
petition
have
to get
I don't
one
know, because
nation under God.
first you have the let's remove
Outta
this,
there.
and then you have like how do we replace it?
Oh,
'Cause you
Jim,
can just
thank
skip
you
the
so
clause.
much. Love you, Jim.
But if you have interoperable language, right? So if you have the ability to subtract a particular piece of language,
Yes.
then
Dave,
you can
yes,
effectively
Dave.
modify a
Very
document
much, yes.
piecemeal. So that's part one. So part one is agreement. Part two is
conversations like this,
structuring the
Dave,
language
are-
so that you can remove a piece
are
of it.
part of
part
that.
three is
What I call cultural
if you're doing it based on majority
Cultural
vote,
restoration.
then when someone makes the vote, it changes for everyone. And then the question would be how long until you can have another vote to insert that thing back or something similar back.
Yeah.
And
One
then
nation
if
under
that's-
It's an interesting parameter.
or alternatively, if it's not a majority vote system, and rather if you have 73% of people vote for and the rest vote against, then that fractures the nation, and then you have two nations. It's basically a branch. So if you
Yeah,
have
right? Yeah.
if you have a branch configuration, then the question
Beautiful
becomes
man,
like how do
arigato.
you transition the assets that are held by that nation. And if all of the assets that are held are held in, let's say, crypto, and then you basically have everything on a blockchain, you can actually fork the chain based on, hey, this was out of the 100% of people, there wasn't above an 80% agreement, and since there was below an 80% agreement, then there was a fork that happened, and so now you have Nation A and Nation B.
Yeah. So did you know that when the U.S. was founded, there was a proposal that that the Constitution only be valid for 19 years?
Why 19?
Thomas Jefferson calculated that the debt incurred by a nation should not be supported by people generations later who had nothing to do with the purpose of incurring that debt.
Ooh.
And therefore, there should be a revolution to the point of rewriting the Constitution every 19 years, because he believed that that was a good thing given life expectancy and, et cetera, when people would be being born who were going to be saddled with debt that they did not take.
See,
it's funny to think that actually he probably would agree with you if he had any idea what the hell a cryptocurrency was.
And sitting here, I'm like listening to that, and as a citizen of a nation state, like I don't know, whatever, a cloud nation, as a citizen of a cloud nation that is soon to be formed, we'll call it that. Mm-hmm. I would like to vote that clause be in our Constitution.
Humanity,
do you agree?
Good one.
And if we're the only two citizens at this moment, we both agree, then cool, that sounds good. Like, yeah, let's revisit it every 19 years. Sure. Hey, a smart person suggested it, and we like that.
So to the extent of your branching argument as well, right? I think that there's interesting historical precedent for that discussion also reflected in American history, right? When you look at the Federalist Papers and kind of study through them as philosophical treatises, it's interesting to see that part of the idea of a limited federal government in the United States was originally that the states should be self-sufficient and self-governing so that they can address issues at different scales, but also so that you can have like heterogeneity within the state itself in regards to certain policies. When you overly centralize power into the federal government, you have people who are very detached from certain problems, making decisions, even though those problems don't affect them, right? So, like, the number one healthcare issues in the South are nothing like the healthcare issues in the Northeast.
No.
Right? So things like cancer are huge in the Northeast. Things like obesity and heart disease are huge in the South.
Well, so for me, that brings up this notion of interoperability, right? So if I can only, I think legally, I can only hold 2 passports. I only have one, unfortunately.
That's fine.
It depends on what those passports are. You can hold multiple passports depending on what the passports are.
Okay, so you can hold multiple passports. So if I hold multiple, and I don't know what the equivalent here is, but multiple passports to different cloud countries, let's say in a biological sense, I hold a passport to the Southwest because my medical issues would be more statistically significant in the Southwest. But I also hold citizenship to this larger nation, which is, people in technology or something like that. Mm-hmm. So multiple passports, which gives me multiple voting rights in multiple overlapping agreements, and so on and so forth.
Similar to the way that you vote in local, state, and federal elections today.
Right.
So the idea, right, is that you have to have a least common denominator, right? And that was the idea behind the federalization of states in the U.S. Is that you can have counties and even local, and even you can even have special taxed districts in the U.S., right, which are just these micronations that effectively exist, but they're not nations. They're just special tax zones where taxes in that area
without representation.
In a lot of cases, right?
Yeah.
In some cases, you have taxation with representation, but they're like weird tax zones that only include these blocks within a city and like weird stuff. John Oliver, who I'm not generally a fan of, actually did a really good job explaining that.
I'm surprised by that.
John Oliver, he just became too much of a propagandist making cheap jokes, and he just soured on me. It's like, I don't know. Like, it's funny, like, I don't know. I used to be a huge...
So before because I know I'll be really into a tangent. So for those who just joined, because we had a batch of new people that just joined, so we're talking about how to start a new country. And there's a link in the chat to the article that we're talking about. But there's 7 ways to start a country: election, revolution, war, micronation, seasteading, space, and the one that we're discussing is cloud countries, which is I would say, a formation of agreements that focuses on the land last. So over time, we eventually crowdfund territory in the real world, but it's not necessarily contiguous territory, because an underappreciated fact is that the internet allows for network enclaves. Put it another way, a cloud country need not acquire all its territory in one place at one time. It can connect 1,000 apartments, 100 houses, a dozen cul-de-sacs in different cities into a new fractal polity?
Fractal polity, yeah.
With its capital in the cloud. Oh, I like that phrase.
Capital in the cloud. I like anything that involves the word fractal, personally. It's funny, like, there's a lot of countries that aren't continuous, right? Like, the United States is not, but also neither is Russia.
Interesting. How is Russia not contiguous?
Take a look at the map of Russia, everyone. Russia has a seaport in the Baltics.
Let's look at it.
That's completely removed from all the other landmass of Russia.
Is a country with islands, that's still non-contiguous, right?
Yeah, I mean, it would have to be, right? All of the land masses in both Indonesia, for example, or in Vanuatu. I mean, looking at the history of I'll choose Vanuatu because I'm oddly more well-versed in the history of Vanuatu than Indonesia, but the bar is set very low.
And all the other territories.
It's interesting to look, right? How do you create a national identity amongst hundreds of islands, right? And people who typically have had very removed lifestyles, cultures, and traditions for the most part. I mean, Vanuatu, they were quite good at boating because anyone that lives in the South Pacific and island nations are good at boating. But there was interesting is they basically created and forced a central pidgin language in order to create a national identity around a language, which is a move taken straight out of Alexander the Great. Right? The idea is all Greeks need to speak Greek, and anyone who's in the Greek Empire must speak Greek as like a lingua franca, and that will be what unites us. And to a large extent, that was always kind of the basis for it. What's interesting is that in the United States, they never solidified a national language. Right? In the early U.S., you'd think, and everyone will have to speak English, and there we go, and we'll be done. But what's interesting is they never did that, and I don't know how deliberate that was, but it's interesting to see that there's no reason why you would have to do that, so long as you have the same values. And from a psychological perspective, I also don't think that you necessarily have to do that, at least not today. Like in a cloud nation, there's no reason why you would have to say everyone needs to speak the same language. So long as everyone has those same values, which could potentially be determined, the definition of which could be determined through something like smart contracting, you could get the ability to have values that emerge from which one defines the national identity without needing to have a single language, right? And with machine translation, there's no reason why a cloud nation would need that, because you can just auto-translate anything from like 80 languages immediately now.
Yeah. That's a really interesting bit, that like the benefit of a cloud nation is that you wouldn't need a unified language and everybody could still understand each other.
Yeah. I think that's one of the, I mean, for me, it raises a really interesting social and psychological point too, right? Like, what is the least common denominator of human values? Like, that's been a big question in psychology for a long time, is what's the least common denominator in human values? Like, obviously there's certain things that reoccur throughout like religion and culture, like thou shalt not kill, right? Like pretty much everyone is in agreement that like that's a no-no. But then there's loopholes of like, well, if you're being attacked, then you can. Then you got to do what you got to do. And that's also generally well established in every culture and religion. But then there's certain things that like now we look back on and we're like, ooh, that was not so good. Like you look at the Old Testament or in the Pentateuch in the Jewish scriptures, and you're like, ooh, the book of Judges. It's like, oh, you're the chosen people, and so Joshua can do whatever he wants to anyone who's outside the group. Inside the group, you can't kill anybody, but outside the group, you can just kill and enslave everyone. And so now we look at those values and we're like, we're not going to do that. And so something has happened where we're gonna shift from that.
I want to throw in some enthusiasm for fractals. I heard the word fractals, and I saw Justin get excited too. I did a pretty deep study on fractals, like specifically, like was that S systems? Like it's a software thing, like used for like designing video games, like infinite amount of like organic, designs that can be created in like RPGs and stuff. But fractals are really cool because it's like, as long as you have like a really good set of rules, it can support infinite.
Show you this, Elise?
What do you got there?
It's a tattoo of the equation for the Mandelbrot set.
You're such a nerd.
I got it. It's from the font and everything is from the Arthur C. Clarke documentary on fractals that he did.
Oh, that's cool.
Ago.
I'll have to check it out. Yeah, no, fractals are great. They support infinite amounts of complexity.
Oh, man.
So Brian, what you're talking about and what you want to do, like this ideology would totally be set, but it's all about having a strong foundation of rules that infinite amount of complexity would be based upon. And I think about it like
the base unit.
Yeah. I think about personally how I applied that to my own life. It's like when you set your own personal boundaries and you communicate those boundaries with the people you interact with, it will allow you to go through your life to have infinite amount of relationships and connections and understanding with people without having to constantly be, checking things and worried and having anxieties or insecurities, as long as you have that really strong base set of rules. And then just let the fractals just balloon. It's incredible.
Yeah. Not to go straight down the looking glass, but there's this idea in people who study emergence in complex adaptive systems, right? That there's different kinds of emergence, and one of the kinds of emergence that exists is called generative emergence. For which there's a really nerdy paper that I wrote on lossy intersection matrices and a way to study this culturally. And so the idea is that you can take a computational system and just put very small rules, like the rules that govern our social interactions. And what emerged from this is, from this complex interaction of thousands or millions of little computational agents that follow these rules, you can get near infinite complexity from this, but you can also get different kinds of social complexity. And what's fascinating and really underpins a lot of the simulation work that LaRon and I have done is the idea that by defining these micro rules at a psychological level and how we interact with ourselves as individuals and as people on a social network, which is a fractal social network anyways, that repeated fractal in structure gives rise to what we call culture itself. And that's how we go about modeling things like culture and religion, is that we effectively view it as a fractal system. And it's one of the main reasons why, I don't know, when I first started studying fractals, it would have been 11 or 12 years ago, because I remember where I was in Vermont the first time I read
the
fractal geometry.
Your tattoo is in a decent place,
and just it blowing my mind. And it was one of those ideas that just totally changed my outlook on everything. But then applying it mathematically to the study of human culture in the AI space, man, weird stuff happens. You get extremely accurate predictions. We've used this approach to predicting the demographic shifts of religion in Europe and been able to get 300% accuracy increases over using standard statistical and probabilistic measures. So this approach that's rooted in the idea of a cultural fractal, I love it. I love it. I think it's the basis of everything. It is the basis of everything that exists in our society. And the quicker we realize that and can leverage that, I think the better off we will be. And I think the more stable we'll be. I don't think, I think the over-centralization of power is always a problem. When we can figure out what our base units of being good people are and put that and reflect that in our laws and use that to iterate everything else, then that becomes a really interesting basis, I think, for law and stability. Is if you start with rules that effectively amount to what's the highest law of the land? And if the highest law of the land is don't be an asshole, you have a lot of freedom to do anything else.
Yeah.
But if the highest law of the land is, oh, you're not allowed to do this one thing without paying this tax, and you have to go through this system that we regulate with this bureaucracy in order to do X, and you have that defined for all these different aspects of life, then you don't have a fractalant system. You have a starfish, or you have like a star, like a central, like a hub and spoke system.
I remember
those are not resilient systems.
You were the reason that I read Spider and the Starfish.
I love that book. It's very
ago.
much, I don't even think they mention the word fractal.
Yeah.
But effectively, that is what they're talking about.
What I really love about this is this chunking, right? So you said don't be an asshole.
Don't be an asshole.
Like don't be evil.
Chunk, not being an asshole.
So don't be evil was, Google's motto, and then they were like, actually, we're going to remove that because we are evil.
Yeah, right.
So
it's a couple worst nightmare, but we're billionaires. So, yeah.
So what's interesting is that if you look at that phrase, don't be evil, 3 words, right? And so I'm thinking of this like cow.
I prefer
so
don't be
what
an
I'm
asshole.
imagining in my mind is essentially, kind of like Stripe, right? So you're like, all right, well, I want to start taking payments, so I'm going to set up a Stripe account, and then I'm going to install the code on my website, and voila, I'm off to the races. So I'm thinking of that process where it's kind of this, creator system, or if you think of like a no-code platform that helps someone who doesn't know how to code to build something. And I'm thinking of this like portfolio of like, okay, like what would you like to start to create your constitution, and so, and you have this library of things, and in that library it says don't be evil. So you click on the don't be evil
See, the thing
bit,
is, everybody
and
has
it basically
assholes.
starts to assemble your
That's
constitution
more
based on these chunks of language.
Neutral.
What's interesting about don't be evil is that it's a negative. And one of my favorite quips is that the universe doesn't understand negatives. And so if you say don't be evil, oftentimes that you become evil. And so simultaneously, like I said, what was I saying? That the universe tends to manifest exactly what you say don't do, right? So like being able to allow someone to assemble their constitution, and then in the process of assembling it, share the basis for where these things were learned and what those things are tied to. So if you say like, oh, we are going to revisit our constitution every 19 years, and then hover over the little, info dot, and it says this was originally proposed by Thomas Jefferson for the United States Constitution. It was not enacted, but Jefferson believed that it was Jefferson believed that was, with life expectancy, when people should have the ability to revisit their constitution because they weren't alive when it was formed. And so being able to say like, this breadcrumb of like citation and the beliefs behind it, and then allowing people to choose whether or not they consent to that tiny little piece of a story, right? Like that tiny little piece of a story of, I think that we should revisit our constitution every 19 years based on the fact that the people who are being governed by it at this point in time would not have been born when those agreements were being formed. Yeah, I agree to that. Cool. That's it.
One of the things that I like that, but one of the things that one has to watch out for is something that humans do all the time, right? Which is called epistemic vigilance. Whereas when we decide what we believe and what we agree with, we value it based on one, effectively like, does it say something real, or did someone who we trust say it? And when it comes to trying to deal with like an objective system or a fractal system, who said it is irrelevant. What was said and the basis or the proof, right, in the logical sense, the proof of it being correct or logical, right? What's the basis? What are the assumptions of the claim? Those are what you can build a fractal system off of, because a fractal system does not care anything about who. It really only cares about what and why. But once who becomes part of it, who is only a single point. You can't iterate a who except to duplicate them, right? But when it comes to what or how or why, those are things that you can change and replicate with slight changes in a fractal system. But the idea of a who, it assumes an ego. It assumes a one, right? But not like a holistic one. It assumes like an individual.
Soul food, yeah.
And that's kind of incompatible. So I would say be very careful of humans' tendency to deny a fact based on who said it.
And I just
erroneously deny it.
I just looked at the time and we have to jump. So let's end here, and we will be back in a week or 2 weeks. But yeah, follow our account, and we'll go from there. And end the stream. I
Very
didn't
cool.
Please
realize
design a
the
fractal on your flag, Brian. Please.
Yes, that would be a very visually confusing flag. But
So it's funny. So this point, right, that would be visually confusing. That's why I went with the equation, right? How do you get a tattoo, an image of something that's infinitely complex? And I was like, you can't. You got to just do the math.
all right.
And so I did the math.
Love you both long time. I'll talk to you soon.
Bye.
See ya.
Thank you.
Yeah. Elise, my next tattoo, by the way, is
Yeah.
the equation for entropy.
Oh,
To
wow.
keep with my nerd theme. Yeah.
That's
I'm gonna
cool.
get the equation for Shannon entropy done across my arm. I'm going for the forearm. I think that's where I'm gonna go. There's actually I have a couple of places I might put it, but
I
I
think
know that that's gonna be one of my next 2 tattoos.
like, okay, so like if you were to tattoo a real fractal or visualization of a fractal or put it onto a flag, I think you could visually represent it. It may not be a true fractal because true fractals are infinite and never ending.
Yeah.
But like you could, because people understand that image. Like what's that? The vegetable, like the one broccoli vegetable that has the fractaling. What do you call that?
Yeah. That has the fractal instruction. I mean, there's a lot. I mean, you could even do a flower, like a sunflower. I mean, in a sense, right? Anything that follows a Fibonacci sequence is a fractal. So you could do almost any plant, really, right? And just be like, that's a fractal.
Yeah.
Like trees are fractal. You could have the fractal tree, right? You can like generate a fractal tree.
Yeah,
and
isn't that like the
stuff.
iconic? There's like a tree that's like kind of the iconic symbol for like S systems. I just learned it from the
Yeah.
context of like video game design, and I thought that was
Oh,
so
yeah.
interesting.
It's like everywhere in video game design, and like computer graphics generally. Like you could not do any modern computer graphics without fractals.
Yeah.
Have
yeah.
you seen what was it? PBS did a documentary called Hunting the Hidden Dimension.
I have not seen that.
Oh, you'd love it. They talk
Okay.
about how they'd use it in video game design, how they've used it in phones, but also how they use it to study like biology. And that is what blew my mind and took me down the rabbit hole. For example, do you know that the ratio of tree branch to trunk can predict the actual density of the forest as a whole for trees in rainforests?
Are you kidding? No, I didn't know that.
Right?
That's crazy.
Doesn't that fucking blow your mind? Like, like the fact that the forest itself is reflected in every branch of every tree is fascinating to me.
Yeah.
So looking at those like chaotic systems, that's what I absolutely love. So that that took me down a huge because of course being a more like analytic mind, I just went into like the math of how this works, and I just stopped looking at reality the same way once I was like, this is like a thing that exists and can be measured. I loved it. I just like it totally changed everything, and it like the way that I was studying culture and religion, I totally got rid of the stuff I was doing before and really went head on into like modeling and simulation work because I was like, I have math for this now. No one else has math for this. And it was really just because I reappropriated stuff that came from like Benoit Mandelbrot and Alan Turing and Claude Shannon and like guys who have been around since the 60s. It's just no one thought to apply their math to culture and religion.
Yeah.
And when you do that, it turns out like shit gets weird.
Yeah. Well, it's weird or it's like reassuring. It can be confident building if you look at it the right way. Okay, so I got a question. So when it comes to like S systems, like are there like bug checks? Like is there testing afterwards to like you're watching it in action and you can see when there's problems and you can fix your equations to account for errors that are made? Does that happen? I mean, it seems like that would happen, right? That like
is there error correction?
yeah.
Yeah. I mean, there's error correction in all systems.
Right.
I don't do a whole lot with error correction in a lot of the simulations that we do because we rely on the iterative determinism of the fractal itself. So we assume that the fractal is constructed correctly, And any error correction we do happens in a stage that we call model validation. So we do it at a really large scale when we're looking for errors and error correction. And we're usually focused on what mechanism in the creation of the fractal would have created that error. And so that's something that's really kind of, that's where we kind of look at it. But there's also like some really interesting stuff. I don't know if you follow James Gates, the physicist, at all.
No.
He's a physicist at the University of Maryland, and he believes that he has found a set of equations that define certain behaviors at the quantum level that mimic the error correction equations that we use in modern computing, which has led people to kind of go, wait, is this proof of the idea of the simulation hypothesis? And the answer is, I have no idea, but that's a fun thing to think about, because it coincides really well with Leonard Susskind's research on black hole theory that found that the amount of information that's found on the event horizon of a black hole, so a two-dimensional structure, is equal to the amount of information in the volume of the structure, in the three-dimensional aspect of the black hole, which suggests that information in our universe can be projected from a binary of ones and zeros into the multi-dimensional universe that we experience. And so it suggests that if that's the case, and at the quantum level error correction is going on, that even if we are not in reality in a computational simulation, we could simulate reality with extreme reliability and one-to-one sort of correspondence between the silicon 0 and 1 world and the real biological world in a way that's really kind of interesting to kind of think about.
Yeah.
It's a trippy rabbit hole to think about. I've lost sleep over it.
Yeah, that one I see could scare people, could bring up some fear. But yeah, the reason why
it's an uncomfortable idea.
I asked about the the corrections is that, like if a system like this was applied to a country or a nation, like that review of the Constitution every 19 years would essentially just be would be reviewing on a holistic scale, is this thing really growing the way we anticipated it to grow from the beginning? And like, is there any corrections we need to make to the base rules, based off of how it's actually implemented in real life?
Yeah, I think that it's actually a really cool analogy to think about. I like it a lot. Like, I've thought a lot about the idea of using, because we do a lot of policy simulation. And when you're doing policy simulation, that's what you're doing. You're just computationally simulating the policies that exist in a legal structure and trying to look at what the outcomes are and how can you understand those outcomes in relation to human psychology and the decisions that people make, and how can you use that to kind of optimize different policies and decisions. And the answer is never really straightforward. But looking at it from that level, it kind of becomes interesting, because then it kind of raises the question of like, wait, if we created like a DAO cryptocurrency in order to create this micronation, is there also a way that we could utilize something that Laurent and I have been fascinated with for years now called auto simulation in order to test if those decisions are okay, right? Because to say it's acceptable is one thing. Like, there's a difference between having something that's logically okay and something that's a good fit for a specific context. And which one you go at any one time is an interesting debate, whereas the human agency comes back in. But utilizing some system where you can automate the simulation of the system based on external information, and you just create the framework for the simulation, is something that's really difficult. And it's one of those like really hard problems in simulation that I argue Laurent and I have actually solved, because we can take like a subreddit and run that subreddit into a simulation system, and we can auto simulate that community and do that sort of a thing. So the question then becomes, what are the rules of engagement between individuals in that system? And that's where the fun part of the simulation comes in. But if you have everything defined in smart contracts, couldn't you also then convert the code of the smart contract, or at least the pseudo code of the smart contract, into a simulation platform that could also run the logical consequences of that decision at a systemic level for the organization. I don't see any reason why not.
Yeah, that seems great. I mean, I would probably want both, like a proactive approach, like what you're saying. So you run these auto simulations beforehand to test things, and then you also retroactively look at the implementation.
Yeah.
It'd be interesting to see like how much matching there is there, and then that auto simulation is just going to get stronger and stronger every cycle, right? Because your information is more known.
Yeah, it could be, if that's the way that it would ultimately work. Yeah, it's possible that it could be. What's interesting, I mean, so like, you would likely see that, but it depends on the availability of the information, really. It's hard to say whether or not it would get better at every turn. A lot of complex adaptive systems, they themselves have a sort of resiliency to them, but it depends on how the system that would be testing it from an auto simulation perspective is designed. So it might be the case, but it's not necessarily the case. The human system should get better at every iteration in theory. Typically anything that like S systems, right, are systems that follow in their critical features a power law dynamic. And so power law dynamics are things like, with like social networks and the way human social networks naturally form. And our social networks are super resilient. And for better and for worse. But like that's something where like any system that's built on top of a human social network would also have should in principle have similar resiliency or reflect the resiliency of the underlying network itself.
This is a little off topic, but do you know anybody who's done any of these types of auto simulations for extreme inflation?
Look, for like hyperinflation?
Like hyperinflation, yeah.
No.
I'm
I
curious
don't. I
about
know,
that.
like, that's another thing I've lost sleep over as well of looking at, because there are reasons to believe that the nature of the human social system is itself a cause of hyperinflation, but it's only a cause of hyperinflation insofar as the key value mechanisms of the economy are no longer pegged to that social network. They're pegged externally to a highly centralized objective value mechanism. And that objective value mechanism cannot react to economic context as fast as a distributed network system. And that imbalance can lead to runaway valuation changes, which would be a hyperinflation situation. I mean, honestly, that gets down to like the brass tacks is why I favor Austrian economics as like a favorable economic theory to use as like the basis for policy, is because they assume that value happens at the individual level, and if you overly centralize it, you basically create too slow of a system. But the closest thing that I can think of to that, actually, now that I think about it, there's a simulation that gets close to it, that was done for Joseph Tainter's work in the 1980s. I think it was 1988. Joseph Tainter wrote a book. It was published with Cambridge University Press called The Collapse of Complex Societies, and I super recommend it because he goes into the archaeological record and the historical record of the collapse of these different societies. And he doesn't just limit himself to like one or two societies. He goes over like 20 or 20 some different societies, including like, from North America and South America, looking at like prehistoric nations in South America, for example, looking at Maya, and I think he also looks at the Iroquois nation. He looks at Rome, he looks at the Egyptians, he looks at different Chinese empires, he looks at a whole range of them.
Exactly
and what he finds is that there is a common trait, if you want to call it a trait, but there's a common pattern in that there's a system of declining marginal returns on investments to certain social problems that end up being tied to a pegged currency or a fiat currency that lead to runaway hyperinflation of a key resource. where the value of that key resource, even if it's not monetary, effectively goes nuts. And in some cases, you can see it correlated with the debasing of a currency. Like in Rome, for example, the Roman currency was debased, basically because of the response of the empire to different resource shortages. But you can also look in a number of cases where you see empires that just like, it was a perfect storm, right? Like when you look at, for example, the collapse of the Mayan Empire. The Mayan, the idea that like the conquistadors were the collapse of the Mayan Empire, in a way, is a really bad view of history, I think. The Mayans were far too powerful to have been taken down just by conquistadors. That's like, that's some Spanish arrogance right there, to think that the conquistadors were so great that they could have taken down the Mayans. It's like, when you just look at the facts of what the Mayan Empire did, you're like, yeah, okay. Yeah, let me get a couple of Spanish guys. The guns were not enough. I mean, like, the atl alone could pierce Spanish armor. So just, there's no way that the military might of the conquistadors was any match to the Mayans. Like, the Mayans would have torn them up any day of the week. But the fact that it occurred at a specific time where there were also known resource shortages and drought, while they were coming over, and the conquistadors were able to do that and bring a number of hosted, unknown diseases from an autoimmune perspective, it created a perfect storm where the collapse of that society was just like, it just happened so quickly, and it looked as if the conquistadors were this great, God-inspired military force, but it's like they actually had very little to do with the collapse of the Mayans. They were an interesting inflection point in history, but there was this larger context that the archaeological record has now shown us about the Mayans that suggests that like the conquistadors actually played a very small role in the collapse of that society. The Mayans themselves were far too powerful to have been taken down by the conquistadors. So I don't know, I definitely suggest it, but it's a really interesting book because it actually suggests that hyperinflation is related to a mismanagement of resources because of hyper bureaucratic centralization, where the bureaucracy creates its own problems and then says, we need to solve the problem, so you need to give us resources to solve the problem. And as you feed that beast, you create hyperinflation contexts. And that has been simulated on at least one occasion. I wanted to do it, and we have a project that we call Project Narcissus. It's an unfunded project that's not related to our corporate entity at all. It's like a conglomeration of different groups that are interested, mostly nonprofits, where we've wanted to simulate exactly this. And we have a budget where we would be able to do this for like at a global scale, because we want to look at this as how we can look at climate change and how the global response to climate change is very obviously close to becoming a declining marginal return situation that could lead to hyperinflation. And so what we want to do is utilize simulation to say, look, here's how we can maximize the return on investment for figuring out how we can do climate change legislation without trying to create contexts where hyperinflation of a currency could become an issue. Because in any nation, that just destroys. I mean, your state is done once your currency hyperinflates. There's nothing you can do except just wait for it to settle down and hope everyone forgives your debt and you can restart or pay your currency to something else. Otherwise, you just screwed yourself. Like it's the end.
Yeah, I mean, I'm kind of feeling like, because I'm in it, right? Like I'm in supply chain business, and I've been seeing it for over a year, and I've probably been talking to y'all about it that whole time. And like the mainstream media is just now starting to talk about it because they can't not talk about it, because we've had like our biggest inflation numbers in 30 years, and just in the past month, inflation's gone up 1%.
In a month,
just
right?
in 1 month.
We're supposed to have max of what, 2.5 a year is what the Fed's hoping for.
And so Biden and everybody is like, oh, it's just temporary. It's just a pandemic. It's just temporary. And I'm trying to say, hey, this is not temporary. And I'm really curious about this kind of research. So I'm definitely going to pick this book up, and I'll probably end up doing like a reading on my streams, so we can all learn
Dude, hit me
together
up.
from it.
I think I just tried to link with you on LinkedIn as well. I don't know if you use LinkedIn at all.
I do, yeah.
I just hit you because I was like, wait, are we not linked on there? And then so I linked you on there, and then I was like, follow Alan Analytics too. But like, if you do, hit me up on an email or something like that, because I'm a huge fan of Tainter's work, and myself, and I know another archaeologist who's worked on it, who also does like modeling and simulation. He's this wild Irishman. Like, he's the godfather of my son, so like we're close.
Yeah.
But also, I mean, we could probably get into it and like see how it is. If you end up doing a reading and people are like really getting into it, I could ask Joseph if he wants to be part of it. He doesn't do much.
Oh my goodness. Yeah, no, I've got people interested. I mean, I've got several people on Reddit right now. You know, my other app, people are really into, like, people really dug this conversation, and they've
Very
been
cool.
They've been digging. I've been talking about inflation, and I've like basically like I'm basing all of my stuff off of my gut of what I've been seeing, and I've been trying to like give inspiration to people to not be afraid, because like when you're afraid and angry and emotional in response, like it gets worse. So like focusing on building your resilience, because, and then focusing on this actually being an opportunity for the system to understand its distribution of resources. Like you said, I like how that is, like, you know, like I think it's an opportunity. It's great. Like for a business like mine, it is incredible, because actually my business has not inflated one bit, because I was already I was already on like the high road, right? I was already focused on the top value. And so like my prices, I haven't had to change my prices. I haven't had to do anything. I haven't had any supply chain issues. And it's almost as if like the commodity market, which I was already like 5 times higher than the commodity market, it's like, it's going to trickle up where it's going to be like at the same level. And I see that to be an incredible opportunity for my business. Because we're still going to be, system correction. It's like, it's going to be a system correction. I'm trying to like let people know, don't be afraid, like see it as opportunity. You know, if you base your entire humanness, and this is the problem, I think, people base their humanness based on the amount of property that they own.
Yeah.
Like, that's just kind of the era that we're in. And if that's where you're at, you're going to freaking be flat out by this experience we're about to go through. Versus if we understand that our humanness is our humanness, and like, it's that, like, and it's perfect as it is. It doesn't need to have its worth calculated by its property. Because we're just going to have much less property now. We're going to consume much less just because everything is, you know, readjusting itself.
Yeah, we have to. I actually just sent you a link to the Project Narcissus like synopsis we have on Mythos. To like, you can take a look at it and stuff. So that's a project, like, we've got Joseph Tainter agreed to be part of this as well. And effectively, like, when it comes to this is something I've been trying to like computationally simulate for a while, but that it would take a lot of time and resource. Like, I couldn't do it alone. I would need like people. But there's 3 books that I always say like everyone has to read to understand the next 50 to 100 years. One of them is Joseph Tainter's The Collapse of Complex Society. The other one is Friedrich von Hayek's The Road to Serfdom. He wrote this in like the 40s or 50s as like a response to the rise of the Third Reich from an economic perspective. And the third one is Meadows and Rander's Limits to Growth, which was written originally in the 1970s. The third edition was done in like the 90s, I think, or no, 2000 maybe. And like talks about how they've used a computer simulation to show how climate change will impact the carrying capacity of the Earth. That is to say, what's the maximum population of the planet? And a lot of people who, you know, the capitalist critique of that work has always been innovation will find a way. And
just trust.
It's bullshit. And now there's kind of like a nouveau capitalist approach, which is like, yeah, this is right, we're fucked, let's do something about it, right? Like, let's get on board. But then there's other people. It's a weird one. The politics of it is hilarious. That we can discuss another time. But that book, I always suggest to everyone. It's like those 3. When you get through those 3, like for me, like that just really reinformed how I approach like policy, economics, and politics, to a point where I was like, whoa, okay, like we've screwed ourselves And until we understand why we screwed ourselves, like from a mechanistic standpoint, we're never going to come up with a good answer. It's just going to be band-aids on wounds. And everything I've seen for the last 20 years, 10 years, 15 years, however many years, has really been band-aids on wounds. For the most part, there's very little that I've seen that's been like, yeah, this will help, like systemically to address some of these issues. But if we don't, we're setting ourselves up for an environment where people are going to start returning to more primal instincts. And the situation, right, where we kind of discussed about it before, right, like nowadays, you know you're not supposed to kill your outgroup. But if back in the day, we thought that was a great idea. The context in which that was a great idea is one that can be evoked, I think, from different environmental standpoints. And we're getting to an environmental standpoint of scarcity where that becomes a thing. And that's super worrying.
Yeah, primal definitely needs like a revamp and definition, because I think like in like whatever mass culture understanding of the word, it's like this like very violent, kind of crude, like Game of Thrones type of viewpoint.
Yeah.
And that's not primal. That's not primal at all. Like primal is love, primal is simplicity, primal is family and community, and like you said, like it could be violence, but like you also have to understand the context of why those communities may have chosen violence, but they definitely weren't choosing dominion.
In some case, they didn't choose it. Violence happened, and they were just defending.
Yeah, they were just defending. That's not violence, but
there's good and bad, I think.
But it all comes to the word dominion in the Old Testament. You know, like that's been documented by a lot of historians to be like the first time that like this ego came up and said, hey, like we have some type of power over the creatures. That like we know what's better for them. Like someone was trying to tell me, you know, a devout Christian was trying to tell me yesterday that dominion is not as bad as I'm making it out to be, and that it's more stewarding. And I'm like, well, even if you use the word steward, that's like pretentious to believe that you know better than nature, that you know better than those fractal systems that are already running on their own beautiful rules and economies and whatever. That like who are we to steward them? We can only steward ourselves, you know, in that context. So yeah,
and that's one of the reasons why I've become very much like, I'm not a fan of overly centralizing power in any structure. It just it doesn't work, because who is that person, or who am I, or who are they to tell the others what to do?
Yeah.
And a lot of times it's not good. I mean, the root of most problems that I see in American politics right now is one group of people trying to decide and force another group of people that disagree with them that their perspective is the only perspective. And we can fill in the blanks of what each perspective is and who is in which group, right? But when I look at it from either side, it seems like that's the big issue, is like there's a group of people being told that this other group knows better than them and they disagree. And the fact of the matter is that all of them are wrong in telling the other group what to do, and all of them are right in disagreeing most of the time. There's a few times where we can put the foot down and be like, no, you're wrong there, actually. But that's kind of the thing. But the way that it's been framed, I think, is really problematic, because it's a zero-sum game. It's like, oh, if that group wins this debate, then we lose everything. And it's like, that's not how it works either. So yeah, interesting times and big problems. But let me know if you end up getting the Tainter book, by the way. I gotta hop, but I would love to know your thoughts on the Tainter book.
I'm gonna do that, and I'm gonna do like a reading. I'll do it maybe like once a week for a couple of hours, and then do discussion.
Keep me posted.
With it. Yeah, I'll keep you posted. I do nerdy shit like this on my streams. I'm probably the only streamer that does stuff like this, but I think it's really important, because it's like we need to move forward and understand what's important for us, because we're going to do it regardless if we prepare or not. So, you know, like I want...
Oh, it's going to happen. Yeah.
I want to be prepared, and I want the people that I love and others that also care and have capacity for love to also be prepared. And it's a simple preparation. It's not difficult. It's not like we have to like go into warrior mode. We just have to go into primal mode.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, there's an interesting thing. I think a lot of it has to do with like the balance of it all. So long as we can find a good balance of it all, then we'll be fine. But
Yeah.
balance requires concession, and that's not something we're good at right now.
Balance of power, matriarchy. Fuck the patriarchy.
Right? Like, there has to be a balance of power. Exactly. Like we were saying before. If one side has too much power, then it ain't gonna work. There's got to be a balance of power.
Yeah.
At least perceived. and the less, and that's the thing, right? When you centralize power, it by nature becomes less balanced. When you decentralize power, it can self-balance itself in a really interesting way that can take into account how different contexts influence the actual potency of that systemic power.
Mm-hmm.
And so that's why like decentralizing the power structures are probably really important, because otherwise you can't give power back to localized communities that actually are where the solutions happen anyway.
Yeah,
So-
someone put it this way, and you can leave after I say this. That like the patriarchy, this thing that like that we're fighting against and being oppressed by, is like this fake economic system of power, right? But the real economic, the natural inherent system is still freaking there. It's not like we have to build it. It's not like we have to understand it and implement and change this like false one into the real one. We just have to remove the false one, and the real one is naturally going to be there.
Yeah, I mean,
which
I
is
like it. Yeah,
reassuring.
vocab aside, and so structurally, I agree with that for sure. Like, yeah, the false one is there, and we need to just not even deconstruct it in like the philosophical sense. We just need to get rid of it and let the natural economy take its case. I mean, you know, fuck the SEC. Like, I'm seeing what SEC is doing to cryptocurrency right now. I'm like, cryptocurrency has the chance to do exactly this thing, and they're just like, no fun for anyone except for our rich friends who will deem that Bitcoin and Ethereum are okay, even though Ethereum had an ICO, and then we're going to go work for firms that are heavily invested in Ethereum. Fuck everyone else. And it's like, you see why nobody likes you? Gary Gensler. I love how the internet, by the way, is taken to always saying Gary Gensler, an asshat. Like, just like his post nomen is asshat. His Wikipedia page could be like Gary Gensler, asshat. But yes,
All right,
I love
Justin.
that. I love that. I'm gonna let yours be the final reflection there. I like that
thanks,
reflection.
Justin.
We gotta let the true economy come back. It's
Yeah.
already there.
It's already there. That's the reassuring thing, is that it's already there. Like that, like, oh,
That's right.
that was like a big thing for me. I was like, oh, cool, awesome. All right, Justin, have a great
Very cool.
evening, and we'll see you soon.
See you.
Bye.
See you. Bye.
Super duper cool, super duper cool. Feeling good, early morning. I'm not usually on here bright and chippy like this, but you know, to meet with these dudes, I'm always down. I'm always down. Yeah, it's fun, Diggle. That's why we can't have nice things. Hey Nick, welcome in. Nice to meet you. Hey, Tropical Thinker, thank you so much for all of your great insight and words. I don't know if you're still here, but I did want to say thank you for contributing so much. And I wish that this conversation with Justin and Brian would have lasted longer so that I could have brought your topics in. But yeah, you had a lot of really interesting things to say. You know, so like I feel like what Justin was saying, like the capitalistic viewpoint and argument against a lot of this kind of, hey Snake Eye, you're still here, Nito, right? Snake Eye, be prepared. Like Snake Eye, if there's anybody who's prepared for what's coming up, it's you. You build your own shit. You know how to cook. You have soil. You're in supply chain. Yeah, so I'm also in supply chain. Tropical Thinker. I'm a CEO of a tech company called Telet.com. If you want to see what we do, I do specialize in one specific commodity called Camellia sinensis, which is tea. And I work with independent. So I exclusively work with independent, family-owned businesses. I don't work with any factories or any traders or any commodity networks exclusively with the small family farms that are making the tea with their own hands. And we do use cryptocurrency. My company was one of the first Bitcoin merchants in the world. We launched the world's first altcoin payment processor. And so we very much take in the ideology of decentralization into our business model. I mean, the fact that I say we, I am the only employee of my company, but I say we because it's a part of that culture. It's a part of that fractal system that I'm trying to create. That, you know, this is much more than just me or even just our business. It's a movement. It's an ideological movement and business model. But I distribute tea. I import it in bulk, and then because it's high quality specialty tea, the buyers of this type of product are, you know, very small scale businesses that it would make absolutely no sense logistically for them to be importing the tea in the small quantities that they order. So I bring economies of scale together for a large group of fragmented buyers. I've been doing this for 10 years, so I've been seeing the cycles. I've, you know, gone to conferences and listened to economists giving their advice. And that's the thing, economists have been giving their advice for decades now about where the economy is going, the lack of sustainability, not only environmentally, like we've been thinking a lot of context of sustainability as the environment, which is true. Like, yeah, let's plant the trees and save the water. But, you know, there's other parts of sustainability too, the economic and societal issues. And the economists have been warning us about the economic and lack of sustainability. This is Bitcoin, by the way. He's the only other employee here. He's our head of security and CFO. He manages all the money. He's a cutie. But, yeah, this is not new information. Like, us entering into this, like, extreme era of economic instability and unsustainability, we've been warned about it. And it, like, I went to a conference 8 years ago, and there was an economist warning us specifically about the tea industry, that for economic sustainability of the Sri Lankan tea industry, they had, he works for Love, yes. Love and treats. Cuddles, love and treats. Yep, that's what he does. Hey, just joking. Welcome in. Good to see you. Thanks for being here. They warned us that the price, the commodity price, the market commodity price for tea, Sri Lankan tea, but when it comes to tea as a commodity, everybody's on the same playing field. So it's not just Sri Lanka. It's like Kenya and Argentina. Everybody's competing on the same price. But for Sri Lanka specifically, the price would have to increase 7 times, right? This guy was giving this warning 8 years ago, and I'm sure he had been talking about it even longer. And it was like as if no one in the room was listening. And these were all the top CEOs and executives of tea companies around the world. And like in one ear and out the other, of course, because it makes them, you know, it threatens their stability. I listened sharp. I was like, what? And ever since that point, you know, I've been talking about this, and, you know, now we're getting to a point where it's starting to like implode right in front of our faces. Like, we're seeing it increasing 1%, 2%. We're like, okay, that kind of hurts. That's kind of interesting. But like 7x, that's 700%. You know, and that readjustment is gonna happen right in front of our faces over the next couple of years. And you can either be prepared for it and be ready for it and not be angry and emotional about it, and not make up these like band-aid excuses. Oh, automation, technology, innovation, those things will cover for it. No, I mean, we've been innovating and automating. We've already been doing that. You know, like, automation is not a new enterprise for us. Like, we've already been doing that. There's only so much more we can do. The system is just adjusting itself naturally. Selective hearing. Yeah, that's what that's called. Selective hearing. We can't behave that way. We have to. I'm doing good, William. Good to see you. So you're just surprised the Fed hasn't increased rates yet. Yeah, the people keep telling, like, whenever I bring this topic up, people keep, like, blaming the government. How much of the tea market is Sri Lanka? Oh, very small, Snake Eye. It kind of sucks that, like, this economist's, like, research and his viewpoint and his presentation was specifically about Sri Lanka because, again, with the selective hearing, people can say, oh, well, that's just Sri Lanka. But it's like, no. These common problems are across the board. Just like I was telling you, like the commodity price of tea in Sri Lanka. So like if you're a tea producer in Sri Lanka and you take your tea even to the local market, that local market is then attached to a global commodity market, right? And that global commodity market is the one that's on the same playing field. And I'm talking cheap, like $2 a kilo is where that MFR is at. Because Coca-Cola and, I mean, I just used that company as an example, but like just the Walmart mentality has like created so much centralized power and so much force to control that price at $2 a kilo or less than $2 a kilo. And everybody has to play within those rules. And it just makes no sense. It's like you can't sustainably produce tea. Have a good day, Joe. Thanks for stopping by. You can't sustainably produce tea for $2 a kilo. You have to think about how I don't understand that, tropical thinker. And I don't know everything. I'm following my gut feeling. And that's why I was really, curious to ask just Bitcoin is like burying himself. That's why I was like really curious to ask Justin if he knew of any researchers that have been running these simulations around hyperinflation. And I'm grateful he gave me that list of books. And I will do reading. I think that'll be my next project. We'll have story time, bedtime story time. And we can read that research together. And hey, if we build enough of an interest and a movement around understanding these things and not selectively hearing, but like really listening, like we could invite those folks to join these conversations and help us understand this much better. But yeah, I think this issue that we are facing and going into, or already in the thick of it, tropical thinker, is like beyond what any government can manage for us. Beyond, sure, they may be able to do some things to make the impact softer and easier to manage, but it's already, we're deep in it. And so all we can do as individuals is prepare, prepare. And, the playing field's going to be even. I mean, of course, the wealthy, actually maybe not, like from a psychological perspective, yeah, it is going to be an even playing field. Like the wealthy may still have wealth as we go through. They will still have wealth as we go through this process. Like they're not going to go hungry, but psychologically they may go fucking crazy because their whole world and their whole definition of value and of humanness is going to go into question. My friend Diggle here, we were talking about this last night. He was telling me, about his life experience, which has involved a lot of financial suffering. I said, hey, like psychologically, you're going to be much more prepared for what we're going into than, the folks that are financially secure. And, the financially secure will go through this whole process remaining financially secure, but psychologically, their whole value system is going to be turned upside down. Versus, somebody who is used to being under the poverty line, they're going to remain under the poverty line. But psychologically, you know, like, they may actually thrive in this. Like, their insecurities are going to diminish because the playing field is evened. It's like, oh, okay, everybody is not as, you know, property owning. Everybody's ability to consume is in question now. You know, because someone who's like grown up or always lived under the poverty line has always had that chip on their shoulder of like, oh, I have less of an ability to consume, I'm less human. You know, so it's going to be kind of an interesting, and I'd love to see like simulations on that. They're going to cut tariffs to tamper inflation down. Yeah, they can do whatever the fuck they want. They can cut tariffs, they can reduce taxes, they can print more money, or they can burn money. They can do whatever the fuck they want. Like, what we're dealing with here is actually not really about money. Like, yes, we're seeing it about money. We're seeing it measured by money. But what we're going into is a readjustment of resources. And resources goes far beyond money. Because what we're going to realize is that our valuation of resources have been false. Right? So, I mean, governments can do whatever the fuck they want. I actually don't mind. That's why, like, the politics, me personally, like, when it comes to politics, I don't put too much stress and emotion into worrying if we have the right politicians in place. Because this, like, readjustment of resources is going to be, it's gonna happen regardless of anything. And, yeah. Snake Eye, it is going to be an interesting future. So we can choose to see it as an opportunity, or we can choose to see it as a disaster, as a collapse. I see it as opportunity. I feel like our system was already collapsed. You know, so I don't know. I'm a very optimistic person. You know, I'm surprised. I still am, you know, with all of the experiences I have. Most people would be fucking jaded. I'm not jaded. I'm like, I feel so you know, I feel so optimistic about what we're going into. But I'm sure going to talk about it and encourage discourse, because that's the only way we're going to understand it and prepare ourselves for it, because it's happening. It's happening, and it's good. It's both. It's both. Okay. Yeah, you're right. It is both. I mean, we're all going to, like, suffer from it. We're all going to go through changes. I mean, even the poor are going to go through a change. I know I said that someone who's been under the poverty line may actually thrive through this. I think psychologically they're going to thrive, because compared to folks that have marked their humanness and identity with their amount of property, psychologically, I worry. You know, I was talking about that last night. I worry for my loved ones, because there is a lot of people, you know, in my circle of loved ones that do measure their humanness based on their property, and I worry for them. And I try talking with them. Like, I've been for years. My business, which I've been working on for 10 years, was freaking crazy. When I first launched, it was crazy, you know, from an ideological perspective. Like, now it's becoming less and less crazy, but in the beginning, and still to now, my family, like, does not understand what I do. My brother does, you know, obviously he helps me a lot, and he's very excited about it. But, like, the rest of my family, like, does not understand it. And, you know, I've been trying to, like, talk to them about it, and I'm not trying to push my ways on them. You know, they can continue on their own ways. But, you know, trying to, like, help them, you know, become aware of these problems that are going to happen. But anyway, resiliency is the key. Resiliency. Yeah, we're all going to suffer. But if we're resilient, we're going to suffer less or potentially thrive. Yeah, mentally, oh, freaking A. And it's going to be ironic because, like, they're still going to be, like, having all the things that they need, but the happiness is going to be really low. The psychology is going to be really messed up. And that's ironic because it's like, yeah, there's people that don't have those things that have, I mean, we're already in that state, you know? People that don't have things experience far higher levels of happiness. And it's all a perspective. It's all a psychological perspective. But anyway, I'm going to get those books. I'm excited. We can do story time. We can sit next to this fire and do story time. But I'm going to end the stream. Reddit, I appreciate y'all. Everybody, especially a Tropical Thinker, I really do appreciate, you know, all of your contribution and ideas. And I hope you come back to more of these discussions because, you know, the discourse and the conversation is what's key and vital here. So I need y'all. I need y'all. But I'll be back. Yeah, hot cocoa while I read. Yep. Yeah, it'll be fun. It'll be fun. I think that'll be a good, like, winter activity to do together on the stream. Is just to sit. I'll probably put, like, a crackling fire on the screen behind me, and we can read, you know. I hope it's not too intellectualized. Sometimes when academics write, the intellectualism is a little too high, but we'll work through it. We'll work through it. If Justin recommended those books, I believe him. You know, Justin's been doing this stuff. But yeah, that seems the project Narcissus seems very interesting. I'd be curious to see, like, a simulation of a matriarchal, you know, context. That would be interesting. All right, Diggle, let's do it. Ah, Snake Eye. I don't know. Well, I mean, I guess these guys want to start meeting at this time because usually we meet at 9 p.m. Pacific, Snake Eye. That's like 11 o'clock at night your time. I'm sure you're in bed. I know you don't watch streams at night, so that's why you miss a lot of my streams, Snake Eye. So yeah, maybe I'll be doing this more often. I like this too, you know, like bright and early and everybody's fresh in their ideas and their energy versus like late at night. But I am a night owl, so I kind of thrive in the later hours, but you know, shifts can be made. But yeah, Snake Eye, I'm really glad that you were able to join in our nerdy talk. He has a fucking tattoo of an equation on his arm. Hey, Queen Box, welcome in. All right. Reddit, I'll see y'all soon. Thank you so much for being here. You know, I'll see you next time. Bye-bye. Snake Eye, you're the only one here, huh? I'm wondering if I should do a raid. I raided Tef last night. He was streaming at like 3 o'clock in the morning his time, 4 o'clock in the morning his time. I was like, are you serious? Yeah, no raid. Oh, thank you, Snake Eye. Oh, you want a raid? Okay, let's go there. Thank you for the suggestion. We'll go do that. Moko made. Let's get him. Oh, Snake Eye, you messaged me. I'll check your message after I set up this raid. Yeah, Tef was making like chocolate stuffed cookies that when he was dealing with the chocolate, it looked just like poo. I'm like, Tef, what are you doing? Maybe he needs to get a better camera because his camera makes everything look like poo. I was like, where's Snake Eye to help troll? All right, let's go raid. Let's go get him. T-raid. See you, Snake Eye. Much love.